All right, greetings, friends. Thanks a lot for coming in. I'm privileged to talk about this lecture tonight. I'm grateful to be here with everyone. We know most of Michelle. I'm not sure I know you. Greetings. Thanks for coming by. Yeah, Darlene, you're here, but I can't see you. Beverly, good to see you. Kathy, I like your palm tree. That's very nice.
Oh, yeah. I want to go there.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, friends. Well, we'll start talking about the lecture, and I guess I'll admit more people as they come in. This is the second time we're dealing with a lecture on shame. And in this lecture, the guy talks about what he calls the right kind of shame and the wrong kind of shame, right? In a nutshell, it seems to me that the right kind of shame is where you acknowledge your shortcomings in following your own spiritual path. In other words, if you realize that you could have done more to move on your spiritual path, you could have embraced more activity or done more to further your own development, you feel ashamed that you haven't done enough. That is what I think the guide is talking about. And that's a good kind of shame because basically it says, I can do better. As opposed to the wrong kind of shame, which basically is a situation where you're kind of in love with your own faults and you drag yourself down. It's really not a real feeling. It's sort of something rooted in deception or the idealized self-image, where you feel that what you're doing is wrong or bad, but that's only because you're deceiving yourself. We have to unpack that a little bit, talk about the wrong kind of shame a little bit, what that's all about. I remember when I was a kid, must have been like 14 years old, and I was on my dad led a trip for his college class. He was a college professor to Italy. And on this trip, there were a lot of college kids. And one of the college girls I became friendly with, I was like, 14, she was like 18 or 19, I guess. And she was talking to me about how she was working with underprivileged people in America and that she was doing some work that needed to be done to help people. And then she said, well, when we get back to New York, would you be willing to help or work on this, maybe give a little time after school? And I said, no, I really can't do that. I'd be too busy or I couldn't do it. And I still remember the deep feeling of shame I felt that I had the opportunity to do something positive that I turned down. So when I read this about the right kind of shame and the wrong kind of shame, I felt that was a good example of the right kind of shame because I realized I could have done something that I had not done. I could have showed up to do something that I chose not to do. So it's sort of like this is a bad analogy, but like when you have the opportunity to go and run or go exercise and you decide not to do it, you feel, hey, I could have done that, but I didn't do it. But the spiritual task of self-facing and spiritual development is a lot harder than that. I mean, that has to do with, as we say, whether you show up in life or not. But if you don't show up and you realize that you're not showing up, then you can do better and then you can show up more. So that's the way I see it, what the guide is talking about the right kind of shame. In the beginning of the lecture, the guide talks about only that person can be truly happy and fulfilled who partakes of this most important food, spiritual development. So we're all here to take in spiritual nourishment and to participate with others in spiritual development. And if we don't do that, I think that we somehow in a deep level feel ashamed that we didn't do that if we had a chance to do that. All right. Also on the first page, the guide talks about I have mentioned several attitudes in the human soul, which are what you might call God eclipsing. That's kind of an interesting statement, don't you think? I mean, the way I interpret that is God eclipsing means making the self the center of the universe and not God's will. Right? God, would you agree, Kevin? I mean, God eclipsing means that you fall under the sway of the idealized self-image, that you have to be perfect. In some sense, you have to supplant God. You have to take the place of God. You don't trust. So,
Can I just say something?
yeah,
In
of course.
12-step programs, they say ego is edging God out. So it'd be the same thing as eclipsing. I just think that's very cool.
Exactly the same thing, right? And
Yeah, so ego and equals ego.
yes.
Using
And of
God.
course, Eva, who channeled the guide, was a big fan of 12-step program. She would often say the 12-step program is a lot like the Pathwork and encourage people to utilize 12-step program. So at the end of bottom of page 1, to recap, the right kind of shame is true repentance. So in other words, repentance without guilt, repentance with an acknowledgement that you could have done better. That's what I think is the essence of the right kind of shame. Now he says there's also shame of the wrong kind. Then he talks about the wrong kind of shame. Let me again reiterate that the first kind of shame is constructive. The right kind of shame is constructive shame. There's a destructive shame, which is the wrong kind of shame. What is it? Guide says, we might call it a guilt complex, which of course is entirely destructive and negative. So when you start fanning the flames of the part of you that you think where you think you're bad, where you think you've done wrong and you can't get out of it, you are somehow lost. There's something attractive about that concept, that you're kind of in love with this idea that you can't change. And that, I think, is part of what he calls the destructive shame or the wrong kind of shame. He says, they say, I'm hopelessly bad and there's nothing that can be done about it. With this attitude, you not only wallow in self-pity, but express a sluggishness that prohibits your working actively on the elimination of that which is wrong within you. So in other words, it's a kind of a giving up quality of giving up on your life and your ability to correct or change your faults or advance. And it paralyzes you. It makes you lazy and stuck. So that's the wrong kind of shame. He says later on that page, the more you deny to yourself the experience of the constructive shame that would make you lift yourself up and work on yourself with realistic self-recognition, the foundation of self-development, the more you despise yourself. The more you do that, the more you need to demand love and respect from others to make up for the lack of self-respect. Later on, he says, your lack of self-respect is not due to your faults, weaknesses, shortcomings, and sins, no matter what they may be, but it is due to your wrong kind of shame. And how do you put your focus on the right kind of shame? He says, all you have to do is adopt a realistic and constructive attitude towards your imperfections. Because I think that at the heart of the lecture, and there's a couple of sentences that I highlighted later on page 3. He says, accepting does not mean wanting to stay in a state of imperfection. It means that you first have to learn to accept your state of imperfection. You should also find out whether you desire to be cherished for your shortcomings as a compensation for your imagined inability to change and thus come to cherish yourself. Now that's a really key sentence. I think we can unpack that a little. I mean, the essence of what the guide is saying is that, we have to accept our imperfections, right? I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? Pretty much everyone says that. But in the Pathwork, we realize what a powerful and strong current we have in our souls where we don't want to accept our imperfections, right? We want to either be above it all and be part of the, or let the idealized self-image run our life, or we want to despair and engage in the wrong kind of shame. But if we're able to, the guide later on in the lecture talks a lot about humility, that we have to approach our life with humility. And of course, at some point says that we've spent many, many incarnations working on some of these faults. It's always good, I think, in the lectures where the guy talks about the length of the pathwork, how many lifetimes one spends trying to overcome faults. So one has to approach one's imperfections in a spirit of humility. He says that later on. Quote, page 3, when you're capable of really and truly accepting yourself as you are, not desiring to appear better than you are, you have fulfilled the basic requirement to be on this path, my friends. Before that, you are not on it as yet, but merely in a state of preparation for entering the gate leading to it. In other words, as long as there is the wrong kind of shame in you, you cannot advance on this path. You have to exchange it for the right kind of shame. So there's something self-indulgent about the wrong kind of shame. Does anyone want to comment on that at this point? How they see it? I mean, we discussed in our last discussion about the difference between shame and embarrassment. Different kinds of what the word shame really means. It's complicated. There's a lot of aspects to it. Yeah, just to reiterate what I said about approaching the pathwork with humility, or your spiritual, the path of self-facing with humility. Bottom of page 4, quote, true repentance in the positive sense means to simply take stock of the self and to accept its weaknesses in their present state with the deep desire to change. At the same time, you need to acknowledge that the change can only come by again and again recognizing the deeply ingrained faults and comparing the faulty reactions to the ideal state. Thus, you learn humility.
Alan?
Yeah.
I was going to ask, so the negative type of shame, that is that also what the guide refers to as the negative pleasure?
Yes, I think so. I think it is.
I forget exactly. Okay.
There's a whole
getting
there's a whole concept of
getting pleasure from. Yes.
Yeah, you broke up a little bit, Jordan, but yeah, I mean, the whole confluence of negative pleasure with a kind of sluggishness, laziness, the stuckness, not wanting to move. That's an enduring theme in the lectures. Yeah, there's certainly the same thing, I think. When the guide says later on in this lecture about being in love with your faults, you're more comfortable with your faults because you're used to them. Even though they cause you pain, you don't want to give them up. Yeah, the guide says, the faults you have been battling against have been ingrained in you often for many incarnations, so you cannot expect to get rid of them within a few years. However, if you're capable of facing these weaknesses, if you meet them with open eyes and a healthy attitude and learn, even while you are still stumbling over them, if you have the humility to face yourself, knowing where you really belong, not too low, not too high, then even though you are still imperfect, you are laying the foundation to a very healthy and normal inner attitude.
Yeah, Alan, can I say a few
Sure,
things?
go ahead.
So this lecture really kind of connects in with there's a lecture 232, and it's called Being Values versus Appearance Values. And the way that I see shame as discussed, at least within this lecture, it's it's kind of discussed as a component of the true versus the false version of self-identification. The true self-identification would be based in what the guide in this other lecture I mentioned calls being values, what you really are in that moment or throughout time, or what your true experience is, versus appearance values, which the guide talks about being a false self-identification. So when I was reading this lecture, instead of hearing the right kind of shame and the wrong kind of shame, because those words are kind of loaded right now in my mind, but instead what I really mostly hear is the truthful kind of shame versus the untruthful kind of shame. Okay, the shame that is truly what's happening, how you are, what you're going through, which is, I wrote a humble acknowledgement of the truth of our earthly lives, from which we can begin our growth or our healing. It includes true self-respect. It resides in acknowledging the truth and cherishing where and what we truly are. Whereas the appearance-based values, which are, again, all show, even show for yourself, right? The inner world of how you may see yourself wrongfully or untruthfully. It's perceptual, right? This kind of untruthfulness on this wrong kind of shame. And I wrote the words untruthful and often overblown. I liked what, Alan, you said, fanning the flames. It's can very much be fanning the flames, right? For the effect of what it shows, right? It's a showing, it's an appearance-based thing. So I wrote down it could be falsely self-deprecating, the self-pity, or it could be falsely self-aggrandizing, this kind of false modesty. And it's based in the appearance value system. But what I noticed also in this lecture that it talks about is it really is a catch-22, because in the process of keeping appearances as your master instead of the truth as your master, you lose self-respect in the process. And you don't notice you're going to lose self-respect when you're doing it, but it leads you into a path of not knowing yourself, because you've basically committed a version of yourself in appearance that's false. And the more you tell a lie about who you are, the more you must believe those lies yourself in time. And so ultimately, your true nature, you start losing that. You start losing that self-respect, that dignity. And then, as Alvin was saying, you end up looking for others to give you that self-respect and that dignity, which again is like, wow, how did I get here into this misery? Well, because most of the time we pretended then to be something we really weren't.
Right, exactly. Like the guide says, you dare not stand for who you really are, because your emotions say that if you were yourself, you would be despised.
Right.
Like I said before, the more you lack self-respect, the more important the respect of others becomes to you.
Right.
So you create a masked self in some subtle way, you become a fake.
What was amazing in this lecture too, Alan, was there was a sentence that said something like, the people who basically love you or something like that, you will recognize that, right? Or you will be ready to see that. And then also those that have not yet been down this path, they really haven't really been offering you that kind of true love anyway, or something like that, it's stated. So you're losing nothing in the process of opening yourself up,
Exactly. I was really struck by that too.
I forgot where it was. I'll find it, but yeah, that was shocking.
Yeah, because like let's look at it like, for example, office politics kind of thing, right? Where you're trying to appear to be the great guy or very powerful or very knowledgeable, and you're looking to impress people. The idealized self-image is in full flower. But if you unburden yourself emotionally to people that are functioning on an appearance value, they're not going to like it. They're not going to approve. But that's because they were never on the spiritual level vibe with you in the first place. So they were not giving you the love, the appreciation you thought they were giving you. The approval was only based on appearance values. So what you thought you were getting was not really love. And when you reveal yourself, then the people who really care, who are on the spiritual wavelength, they come forward and you feel their love. I think the guide is saying that, right? Yeah, I was pretty struck by that too. Yeah, that those folks that you think you're getting love from are not really giving love to you.
Right. You're losing nothing in the process.
They're functioning
Right.
at appearance level. That's right. Yeah.
Just like to comment a little bit here on page 2, Alan, if I may. And something that you read already, which I kind of struggle with it myself. And it is the part where it says you do not have to be perfect in order to respect yourself. All you have to do is adopt a realistic, constructive attitude toward your imperfections. And that's something I myself struggle with, because it's something that, you know, at the intellectual level, sometimes we understand this, and we feel it, and we feel that imperfection, and I torture myself with it, you know, at that intellectual level. But when I read this, it really was relieving to know. You know, I guess I was able to, when I read it, I was able to connect that intellectual level with my emotional level, because as he says on the last paragraph on page 2, is a big difference, you know, understanding that we are imperfect, like I did. You know, I was like, oh yeah, I feel this imperfection, and then I would torture myself with that imperfection. It's like how imperfect I am. And that's exactly where the wrong shame comes from, because then you just feel hopeless. It's like, oh my God, I'm terrible. I'm so bad. It's like, I am really good for nothing with all these imperfections and all these, you know, I mean, I want to be, you know, the best person I can be. But yet at this intellectual level where I am staying, I still feel horrible, because I see all the far away that I am from that state where I wish I was, where I would want to be. But as I realized, when one is able to connect with that emotional level, and as the guy says here in the last paragraph on page 2, as I said, he said, intellectually, you know that you are imperfect, but emotionally, you don't. Often there is a wide chasm between what you know and think consciously and what your emotions claim and desire. It is not at all difficult to make the emotion conscious if only you are willing to take the trouble to translate them into concise thoughts. But it needs a little effort. And you know, that's where I was, you know, to really be able to and that's, to me, that was the hardest part, to really, you know, come out of the intellectual level and really feel with my emotion, with my feelings, what I was feeling. And then after doing that, then I was able to really, you know, pat myself in the back and say, well, you know, now that I feel this terrible state and I have felt it and I know how it feels, I can move forward, because now I know that from here, from this, you know, all this hopelessness, there is hope, because I was able to connect those two. You know what I mean? Feeling with my emotions and my actual feelings, how terrible, how bad, you know, I felt, you know, at this level, and from there, and that's so important here, I think, because that's the difficult part. You know, if we, I mean, it seems difficult in the beginning, but if we are able to really put into concise words what it is that we feel, you know, what we understand at this intellectual level, and really put it into concise thoughts and words, like really actually write it down and and in thoughts, and feel those thoughts, then it's so much easier to transcend that state of hopelessness.
I totally agree. I think that's the heart of it, the lecture. Like, for example, if I were to write down, quiet, happy, if I were to write down, I am a bad person because, then let myself try to have the courage to get rid of the intellectual overlay that is the idealized self-image, which is how all the different ways in which I'm perfect. But if you get down to like, I really think I'm shit because, or I've done something that's bad and this is what I did, And that's why I'm not redeemable. This is why I am not worthy of the best in life, let's say, because I did this. And then to write down, like, you know, it's so interesting how the guide's always talking about writing things down like this and putting things into concrete terms, and how resistant we are to doing that. It's remarkable, really, how much I'm speaking for myself, you know, I don't want to write down that. It's kind of a self-confession. The guide, interestingly enough, says there's a similarity between psychotherapy and confession, right? Where is that? That's somewhere in here. But the idea that you don't want to admit to yourself, or you don't want to concretely admit to yourself your faults.
Yeah, emotional experience, you know.
Emotionally, right. I do think that the guide talks a lot about, you know, the difference between intellectual awareness and emotional awareness. And, you know, the intellect, which is to say the little ego, quote unquote, the little ego, resists the implication or the idea that we're not perfect. Doesn't want to deal with it. Also, that we're not better than everybody else. You know, I know I'm better than you. I know that, right? So the ego is like idealized things like I'm better, but emotionally you don't want to admit it, right? How you feel in that part of yourself, the part that where you're engaging in the wrong kind of shame, right? I'm shameful.
I find also that it's so much easier to escape when you stay at the intellectual level long. You know what I mean? It's like easy. It's like, okay, it's easy. You can wipe it out with another thought, or, you know, some kind of, you know, something very superficial, and let it be at that. You know what I mean? But when you are able to connect that intellect and really connect those thoughts or those intellectual, you know, feelings or reaction with the emotions and the feelings, then you really feel it, and then you can actually make that change.
Juan, the biggest reason for that, I believe, is because the intellect likes to work in concepts, and concepts can easily be non-personal. So when you start studying anything, including spirituality, the intellect is so good at deceiving yourself into believing just because I know the concepts, that means I'm so damn good. You know, so that's why when you read a lot of the Pathwork, what you'll find is there's an area where, you know, there's these questions that come up, I remember, where it's like, well, you're telling us to use our intellect to put our things, use concise words and put it down and whatnot. And I remember the guide responded like, yeah, well, it's not just the intellect, it's applying. The intellect is not bad or good, it's applying it for its purpose. And so utilizing the tools of thought for interrogating your emotional state, your true state of being, that's where the gold is, according to the Pathwork in the process.
Yeah, he says on page 5, as I have often said in private sessions, there is a spiritual law which applies equally to psychoanalysis and confession. It is the law of brotherhood. The moment you open up to another person, you risk an act of humility. At that moment, with that person, you do not want to appear more perfect than you are.
Yeah.
That is one of the most harmful human tendencies, my friends. When you show yourself to one person as you are, you will instantly feel the relief your spirit has cried for, even if that person does not give you a single piece of advice.
Yeah, exactly. I experienced that, Alan, very much, like with confession. And it doesn't necessarily even need to be to like a priest or something, like in a Catholic sense, but of course, really truly confessing to somebody truly your shortcomings, not over aggrandized, but rather truly what you're wrestling with and where you're feeling like you did wrong, where you didn't honor someone in the way that you know they should have been, where you dishonored someone or dishonored yourself. It cleanses the wound, as my mom would say. If I think back to those times, you know, she always used to say, get all of it out, get everything out, you know, clear the air, you know, get it out. So yeah, it was very important. But I wanted to mention also as well, Alan, you mentioned like the words I am shit, right? And it's funny because I know I've said those words many times in my life across many different scenarios, but it's funny because there are certain times when my ego would adopt that kind of self-deprecation in a false way to get off the hook too. So it's really funny. Words are a funny thing. So what I think is important for any spiritual group to know is it's not just the form that it takes, but it's the spirit behind that form, of course, right? It's the actual truth. And you could tell, I mean, I guess when you see two people or when you see yourself and when you're truly being that, saying those words, I mean, it can be liberating sometimes when you really admit to the faults where you've been hiding it or hoping no one notices or
Yeah.
even pretending it never existed or things like this. It's just, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that when two or three people, right, Christ says, right, when two or three are gathered in my name, I'm present, I'm with you. I mean,
Right.
if two or three people really desire to find the truth, I think that the BS will have a hard time hiding, you know, the hard time not coming out.
Yep.
So I think that that's what the guide means by the law of brotherhood, that when we have a sincere intent, we're going to be able to pierce the veil and see through each other's faults and reveal things and feel the humility and the grace that comes from that, which I felt many times in our pathwork groups. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, I remember the Anglican Mass, you know, the whole confession. In Catholicism, you go before the priest. In the Anglican, you basically recite your sins and you confess with, you know, you've done this and you've done that. But it's kind of formal, and I don't think you really feel the impact. You're really not taking a risk by reciting a formula with a whole group of people. You take the risk when you meet somebody directly and you have the courage to admit your faults.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the reason you have the courage is because you're feeling the right kind of shame, right?
Yeah.
In other words, there's something you haven't done that you can do. You feel, hey, you know, I haven't been straight up with my pathwork brother or sister or my, you know, my helper or my friend. I haven't been straight up, and now
Yeah.
that's shameful. And now I'm going to.
Or even with myself, right? And that's the thing. That's the self-deception. I found it, by the way, when you said courageous, it hit my eyes, or courage, because on page 4, I think it is, it's the second paragraph. That's the one that hit me that I mentioned before. If you look on the second paragraph, around 4 lines down on it, on page 4, it says, "So it is up to you to take the one courageous step of becoming yourself and gaining true security and the true appreciation of your friends.
Right.
They who are spiritually developed and capable of love will most certainly not love you less. Quite the contrary. And they who are immature and therefore incapable of love will not be retracting their love for you, since they never really gave it, nor did you ever really own it. For such people find themselves in exactly the same spot as you are in now." That's a great, great truth. Craving for affection, respect, and love to assuage their own lack of self-respect. Absent because they too do not have the courage to be themselves. Their kind of love was an illusion in the first place. So the only way to build a secure ground on which to stand is to stop the pretense you have laboriously cultivated all your life. This seems a hard step at first, my friends.
Yeah, the guide's not mincing words, as you.
Oh, oh, truth bombs all over.
I'd like to, I really want to, I'm chomping at the bit.
You go right ahead. Go right ahead, Ellen.
Yeah, okay. I want to add something, you know, I think I was the one who was like, you know, I wanted to continue this conversation about shame because I knew there was a bunch of things that had come to my attention about shame through the years because I felt it was such a big topic for me. So I wanted to add something to this discussion that's not really in this lecture. It's probably in it in some way, but again, this is one of those cases where I had trouble with the language and I found myself really confused at times. So I wanted to just this was something that I thought was like the most illuminating thing, which is that that positive shame happens when we're children. So when we're babies, we're one with it, right? We're there's no individuation. We're connected to everything. But when we realize, when I think we're about 2 or something, and we realize that there's another person there, that we become aware in a healthy situation, we become aware that we have the ability to hurt another person. And and that to me was like, you know, like really life-changing, because I realized that I was having trouble acknowledging if, you know, there was hurt happening in a relational situation, because I couldn't face the feeling that something that I did would actually make another person feel bad. I couldn't face that. And then a lot of things began to change. But then I wanted to add another thing to that, which is the kind of shame that happens when we experience abuse, like sexual abuse. And so if we're young and we get abused, we, again, because we're not individuated, we believe that we have caused the abuse, right? So so these things to me are more primary, but they illuminate the rest of this conversation, because the only reason really why you would then kind of have delusion about your own traits is because you don't realize that it's not inherently you. So this is where I feel like it'd be hard for me to make the connection to what you guys were talking about, but maybe you'll be able to make the connections between what I just said and what you were talking about.
Yeah, what you said, Ellen, with respect to knowing that there are other people or other entities, or that it's not just you in the world. Yeah, that offers the opportunity to pull back from your true nature in many ways, right? And to be scared of something that's not yourself, or to even be ashamed of yourself and hurting another person. You're right. But it also gives us an opportunity to see another application of this truthful shame as well, because one part of growing up through those years, right, is not only to gain the ability to have this false sense of shame, right, or even self shame. It's to also recognize the truth of having true shame, right, the sense of that we did do something wrong, like you said. So it gives us an opportunity to expand, I think, right, into more applications of those. They're manifested on the next level. And I think as you get older, you also continue to do the same, because your own self-responsibility grows, right? So you become an independent person. You're at some point, in other spiritualities, it's called internal monads, or areas that you grow beyond, right? And so at certain points in your life, how these two things manifest themselves become ever widening, like to some amazing level, right? And so you, even in the the old age, there's a different way of looking at these things, and we kind of pull back, almost back to the same place where everyone is one. If you're of that thought, you can actually find yourself very much back into that childlike state again, if you're focused on that as you transition or go into into your final hours, right?
Yeah, the shame that you mentioned about abuse, that's something that I haven't been abused. I'm not a victim of abuse. So maybe I cannot emotionally talk about it. But it seems to me that there's a lot of complicated feelings in that cluster of the abused person.
And I did experience that. So I figured I should just say it, because I can speak on it a little bit, because it's very much in my experience, which I guess is why my emotions are strong about it. Because, that to me, almost everything in my life that relates to shame has a root. It always can go back to that confusion.
Yeah. Well, certainly the emotions don't make sense intellectually, right? We know that. Like,
Well,
you know,
but they actually, well, they, depends what you're talking
in
about.
other words, I am
Some
why.
of them don't, right? Some of them don't in terms of other things that happen, but then they start to make sense as you start to be able to, as I start to be able to face the shame. Certain things really make sense where they never ever did. So, well, which is, I guess it's happening to me now. Well, certain things are starting to make sense that never did.
I mean, I guess I just have to fall back on the guide's recommendation that we write things out. I think it's very helpful. You know, like I am ashamed because. Yeah, yeah, you've got the journal, right. I'm ashamed because, or either something was done to me and it's shameful because, or I did something bad. To try to get these things out and then to kind of weigh them and look at them and think about whether they represent truth or a spiritual distortion, you know, try to unpack the ways, you know, and of course the guy talks about the attachment of negative pleasure to situations like that and the whole constellation of how things that happen in childhood become stumbling blocks for us later on in life.
I just wanted to add one other thing here that I found a little confusing. I personally think that the guide is mixing up a little bit remorse and shame. That's just my personal opinion. And Kevin was talking about words. I mean, words are so you know,
Well,
they're
well,
very,
that's, I mean, the guide talks about repentance in this lecture,
yeah.
true repentance. And that means, hey, I did something that I shouldn't have done, that I didn't have to do, or I didn't do something that I should have done. And I'm repenting you know, I either did something that I shouldn't have done, or I had the opportunity to do something that I didn't do, I think. Some to impair my own spiritual growth. But remorse, you know, the guide also talks about there's electrical real guilt and false guilt, where, you know, I think remorse sounds like real guilt. False guilt is something that you punish yourself for something that you know, didn't happen, or something that it's again engaging with something negative or destructive. It's a choice of some sort to believe. To create false guilt is also to leave. You know, it's a pathway that you shouldn't walk down if you have a choice, which of course we do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, process. Other people, I yield the floor. Susan, I want what you wanted to say.
Yeah, also having been abused, I'm finding in this lecture that the one area that I can see where I still experience the wrong shame to some degree, and it feels to me like there's the right kind is the right size, and the wrong one is just, it helps me to see it that way. Like when it's not right size, then I can tell I'm going in the wrong direction with this, and it's completely overblown. But it's about the wanting to try and reconnect with my family who exiled me for speaking about the abuse. And so I, coming from that very young place, make myself wrong and like try to save them by making myself wrong and making myself doubt myself. Like I know now on an intellectual level that I can do this after many, many years of deep work. on this. But that's the way that I connect to this. I'm usually, I don't go to that place of oversized shame much anymore. And if I do, I usually can catch myself and come from the place of the adult. That's all I have to say.
Anyone else want to talk about their own thoughts about this? Beverly, do you have any thoughts? Does this, Barbara? Does this bring
Well,
anything?
Michelle has her hand up.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I'll wait till after you, Barbara.
Oh, you can go ahead.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm in the TP in Pittsburgh, and a fellow TPer invited me, though I don't think she's able to come, and I have some company here as well. I was wanting to hear some input on distinguishing, for instance, Alan, the shame thing that you talked about was something generated from yourself that you could have done differently, whereas the two ladies are expressing so beautifully, they had something from outside of themselves forced in. I'd like to hear a little bit more of distinguishing of that. It's still ending up with the person being shamed, but I think out of respect to what the two ladies have shared for us, some distinction has to be made. They still have a lot to deal with and PTSD, but that was another person acting on them without consent, without understanding, whereas you know, the shame you talked about, or not putting forth for a friend when you maybe could have, that's my actions that, upon thinking about it, causes me problems. What is the guide distinguishing between that kind of thing when I'm ashamed because someone has really hurt me and their actions have brought shame to me, or my actions upon reflection are making me ashamed? There's a little difference. Am I verbalizing it?
Oh yeah,
Clearly?
no, there is. I think that when you're abused, I mean, not that I've been a victim of abuse, but someone says it's wrong. Someone tells you to be ashamed. You know, society says, hey, this is shameful, right? I mean, if society wouldn't tell you that, would you be ashamed? That's a good question. You'd be hurt. Okay, I understand being hurt. But doesn't the shame come from the condemnation of others?
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. That was my whole point in what I said. And Michelle, thank you for bringing up what you brought up, because I just think it's so important, and I really appreciate you saying it. No, I mean, that to me is the whole point, is that the shame comes from inside of you because of the confusion that you're a child, and if you haven't individuated fully, you feel it's you. So I think this is so important because it's very, very deep. It's what makes it so deep and hard. And that's why I called what you guys are talking about more remorse, because it's not quite as powerfully, it's the global, to me, what makes shame is the global sense of it. And it's related to what Susan was saying, it's talking about the size, right sized. I mean, it's couple of different ways to look at right sized, but that's one of them.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it seems to me that in that situation, there's a lot of hurt to deal with, unquestionably, right? Now, the question about how you deal with that situation, having been the subject of abuse, how do you cope with it? Are there ways that you can cope with it in a positive way and ways you can cope with it in a negative way? Maybe that's where there's a connection here. In other words, if one is able to courageously go forward and go through that experience and bring it to trusted friends, bring it to a helper, bring it to other people that you have commonality with, go through it, transcend it. In other words, or there might be a situation where you lock it away, you hide it, and then you act it out in different ways. There's a negative aspect to it that somehow you become bound to. Maybe you recreate it, right? So, and that could be the tie-in between the right and the wrong kind of shame.
And that part can be affected by the society around you, because the people will encourage you to hide it. And we were talking about hiding in the last lecture. It was more about secrets and hiding, which is, I think, an incredibly important part of this discussion.
That also has to do with what Kevin said earlier about the people that can relate to you on a heart level, on a true level, and the people that relate on an appearance level. The people that are not really relating to you as a spiritual being, but are basically either approving or condemning, what you're doing for their own reasons. In other words, the people that can really show you love, as opposed to the people that, either accept you or reject you based on what we call appearance values.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I share a little bit also that something maybe that is related to this is different from what the ladies are sharing, but it is something that actually did not come from outside. In my case, wasn't forced upon me or anything, but it was something that caused me terrible shame for all my childhood and and teenagehood, even to great part of my adulthood. And that was when I was little. I think up to the age of 11, 12, or also I was wetting my bed. I would I wet my bed in the middle of the night, and I didn't know. I have no control over that at all. And that's something that made me so ashamed, especially when my mother will go, she had to dry the sheets outside. This was in the Dominican Republic, right? So she had to dry this sheet outside, and she'll be asking the neighbor and everybody, telling them, it's like, I don't know what to do with this kid. Look, he's wetting his bed every night, and he destroyed so many mattresses already, doing this, and oh my God, and I just felt so like, like incapable, so like ashamed. I just wanted the earth to swallow me then, at that moment. And that was such a shame. I feel like I was not a normal child. I couldn't go out and play with the kids my age or anything. I just felt so abnormal, and it was such a great shame. And I did everything I could to escape that, but I couldn't. I tried to do everything to avoid wetting my bed at night. And sure enough, I dreamed that I was being somewhere, and it would happen in my bed, or it just happened automatically. The minute I went to sleep, boom, then my bed is wet, and in the morning, of course, there comes my mother again. Oh my God, he did it again. She made me. She didn't know better, really. I don't think she did it intentionally, of course, but it caused me such a shame for the rest of my life, and I think that affected me tremendously. And I torture myself, like really, really painfully with it, because I just psychologically, physically, I tried to do, everything I could to really avoid, to really try to escape from this shame that I felt, from this problem. And yeah, so I think that was a terrible feeling of shame that I experienced again for, most of my childhood and teenagehood, and even great part of my adulthood. I think, to some degree, I think something is still in the unconscious that I am still working with that to kind of like really behave, I guess, feel like yes, I am a normal human being. That was just a nervous condition or whatever it was, that caused me that, and I really had no control over that, And if I was kind enough with myself, as a child, I didn't know better, but now as an adult, if I had the capacity that I have now, I would have understood, right, and be perhaps more generous with myself. But as a child, I didn't know better, and what my mother did, the behavior my mother displayed, that didn't help at all. So
well, you wonder if your mother had basically say, hey, Juan, okay, everything's fine. Oh, I'm going to wash the bed. It's fine. In other words, not put a big thing on you that, hey, this was very terrible, and you're wrecking the mattress. I guess you wouldn't have felt so bad. So that's,
yeah.
Maybe, Alan. It's true what you're saying. I think it's very true what you're saying, Alan. I've been really kind of meditating on what Susan and Ellen both shared. It's very traumatic for me to also to take what they shared and to go back into my youth and consider the times when I felt tremendously disrespected or bullied or hurt or ostracized. It's not at the same level, sure, as physical abuse. But if I consider that, and I remember it wasn't just about the outside world. There was that component for sure, Alan. I agree completely with that there's a huge component the outside world plays on that. But I do think that there's an internal world that exists at the same time, and the self-judgment, or this, I don't even know if that's the right word because I was so young at the time. So it's hard to even verbalize it clearly as to what it was meaning at the time. But yeah, it didn't really matter if my mom or if my father reacted in a certain way. I hid it regardless. And it was just about the self-shame, I guess, to use that word. And I don't know if that's as it's already been said here. That's not what this lecture is discussing for sure. But the words are similar in what they're, I guess, what they're trying to say. And what it strikes me as is, again, it goes back. One thing is that other lecture that I mentioned about appearance values versus being values. And you lose your being in a sense, or even in that moment, you sort of judge yourself as much less, or see yourself as much less than human. And something gets ripped from you in that moment, at least from me, that I remember. And it's very raw to think back to those times, because there's nothing obviously you can do about it. And in fact, some people would get bullied in the same way that I was and would just have no problem with it. So it's not about like the fact that this was so horrendous a thing in my case, but rather there was something inside of me that felt ready to accept that lower position of myself, you know?
That gets into the whole area of what we bring into this life.
Right.
Because the guy says, we don't come into this life as a blank slate.
Right.
We come into this life with a lot of aspects that were developed in previous lives. And that, people react very differently to the same situation, obviously. And many people who grew up in families where everyone seems to be treated the same have radically different experiences because of what's embedded in their soul substance.
Right. Yeah.
Can I add?
Barbara, go ahead.
Yeah. Hearing about, what Kevin shared, and Juan and Ellen, these seem to be situations where that they don't have control over. They've been either victimized, bullied, or it's a state of immaturity with, growth, wetting the bed, that these are situations that, I don't have control, but I think part of the idea of maybe shame might be taking the situation as something personally, as a fault, and that they should have a feeling inside that they should have been able to prevent it, or act, or do something to overcome the situation. Now, this is, for me, this is one of somehow it connects with this idea of what exactly are faults, and the way the lecture talks about, having victory over faults and getting to a state of perfection. I have a hard time with that. And maybe it's because I relate to all of these other situations where I feel like, well, maybe I don't have any control. It's sort of like, what exactly is a fault, and what's this idea of perfection? I kind of think, in terms of sometimes the definition in Buddhism about living skillfully as being, and like not, and doing things that are less skillful as being a fault, and being more skillful, in that broader sense. So that's what I wanted to say. I'd like to know more about what exactly is a fault, and is there really perfection? What is, that kind of gets me to also like my own childhood of my parents, shaming me about things like, you should